In 213 BC, the most powerful man in the world made a decision. He decided that history itself was a threat, not an army, not a rival empire, not a plague or a famine or a rebellion. History, the act of remembering, the existence of books, the persistence of ideas older than his own reign. He decided that all of it had to go. And so he ordered every book in China burned, every philosophical text, every historical record, every poem, every scientific manual, every account of every dynasty that had come before him, all of it, into the fire. And then when scholars protested, when the keepers of that knowledge dared to speak against him, he had them buried alive. 460 of them. Scholars, teachers, men whose entire lives had been devoted to preserving the wisdom of the past, buried alive in pits in the ground beneath the empire they had spent their lives trying to serve. And then, in a detail so audacious it almost defies belief, he tried to erase that too. The man who ordered the burning of every book in China tried to make sure no one would ever know what he had done. His name was Qin Shi Huang, and he was the first emperor of a unified China. And the story of what he did, why he did it, what was lost, what survived, and what it means, that is what we're going to uncover today. Stay with me. To understand what Qin Shi Huang destroyed, you have to understand what China was before he arrived. For nearly 500 years before the Qin dynasty unified the country, China had existed as a collection of warring states. 7 major kingdoms, constantly at war with each other, constantly shifting in power and alliance and betrayal. It sounds like chaos, and in many ways it was. But out of that chaos came something extraordinary. The period historians call the Warring States period, roughly 475 BC to 221 BC, was also one of the most intellectually explosive eras in human history. Philosophers, teachers, scholars, and thinkers of every kind flourished in the courts of competing kings, each ruler eager to attract brilliant minds who might give him an advantage over his rivals. If a king in one state persecuted a philosopher, that philosopher simply moved to another state. There was always somewhere to go, always another court that would welcome a brilliant mind. The result was a flowering of thought that China would never fully see again. Confucius laid down the foundations of an ethical system built on relationships, duty, ritual, and respect that would shape Chinese civilization for the next 2,500 years. His followers, the Confucians, built schools, wrote texts, trained students, and spread his ideas across the competing kingdoms. Laozi, the mysterious founder of Taoism, described a universe governed by a force called the Tao, the Way, that could not be named, could not be controlled, could only be aligned with. His followers wrote texts of astonishing philosophical depth and beauty. Mozi developed a philosophy of universal love and logical reasoning that prefigured some of the most sophisticated Western philosophical traditions by centuries. Zhuangzi wrote philosophical parables of such wit and strangeness that scholars are still arguing about what they mean 2,400 years later. The legalists, a school of thought that would become crucial to our story, argued that human nature was essentially selfish, that morality was a fantasy, and that the only thing that actually controlled human behavior was law, punishment, and absolute authority. All of these schools of thought competed, debated, published, taught, argued in courts and academies and market squares across the 7 states. This period is known in Chinese history as the 100 Schools of Thought. It was the Chinese Enlightenment, China's ancient golden age of ideas, and Qin Shi Huang ended it. The man who would become China's first emperor was born in 259 BC as Ying Zheng, prince of the state of Qin. The Qin state was not, by the standards of the time, the most culturally sophisticated of the 7 kingdoms. It was Western, militaristic, dismissed by the more refined Eastern states as semi-barbaric. But it was efficient, and it was ruthless. The Qin state had embraced legalism, the philosophy that said human nature must be controlled by strict laws and severe punishments, that morality and tradition were weaknesses, that the only measure of a state's success was its military and economic power. Under legalist administration, the Qin state reorganized itself as a war machine. Farmers were given incentives to produce more food and more soldiers. Military ranks were tied directly to battlefield performance. Kill enough enemies and your social status rises. Fail, and you fall. It worked. Brutally, efficiently, terrifyingly. It worked. When Yingzheng took the throne of Qin at the age of 13, the state he inherited was already the most powerful military force in China. By the time he was 38, he had conquered all 6 of the other warring states. For the first time in Chinese history, the entire territory was under a single ruler. He gave himself a new title, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin, and then he set about reshaping the country in his own image. What Qin Shi Huang built in the years after unification is genuinely staggering. He standardized the Chinese writing system. Before unification, the 7 states had used different scripts. Qin Shi Huang imposed a single script across the entire empire. It was a radical act of cultural engineering, and it worked. The Chinese writing system that exists today descends directly from that standardization. He standardized weights and measures. Different states had used different units of measurement for centuries. Qin imposed a single system, making trade and administration vastly more efficient. He standardized axle widths. This sounds trivial. It was not. Roads across the empire had ruts worn into them by generations of carts. If a cart from one state had a different axle width than the ruts in another state's roads, travel became enormously difficult. Qin Shi Huang standardized axle widths across the empire, making the road network function as a unified system. He built the roads, thousands of miles of roads radiating outward from the capital like the spokes of a wheel. He began the Great Wall, not the wall that exists today, that came later under the Ming Dynasty, but the first connected series of walls along the northern border to keep out the nomadic tribes of the steppe. He built a canal network that connected China's river systems, enabling trade and military movement on a scale never seen before. And he built his capital, Xianyang, into the most magnificent city in the world. He moved the noble families of every conquered state to Xianyang, where he could watch them. He built replicas of every palace he had conquered, arranged in his capital, so he could walk through the conquered kingdoms without leaving his city. By any measure, Qin Shi Huang was a political and administrative genius. The empire he built was the template for every Chinese dynasty that followed. But there was something wrong at the center of it all. The emperor was afraid. Here is the thing about absolute power that its wielders often discover too late. It doesn't feel secure. It feels terrifying, because when you control everything, any challenge to your authority, no matter how small, becomes an existential threat. Qin Shi Huang was afraid of death. He sent expeditions across the sea searching for the islands of immortality. He consumed pills of mercury, believing they would extend his life. Mercury being, in fact, the thing that eventually killed him, likely causing the paranoia and erratic behavior that accelerated the collapse of his dynasty. And he was afraid of ideas. Specifically, he was afraid of the Confucians. The Confucian scholars were not revolutionaries. They were not plotting against him, but they were critics. And in the Confucian system of thought, the emperor's legitimacy rested on his virtue, his moral fitness to rule. A ruler who governed badly could lose what the Confucians called the mandate of heaven. This was a direct challenge to the legalist foundation of Qin authority. Legalism said authority came from power and law. Confucianism said it came from virtue and moral example. In legalist terms, the very existence of an alternative theory of legitimacy was sedition. And the books that contained these ideas, the books of songs, the books of history, the philosophical texts of the 100 schools of thought, were the vessels of that alternative theory. As long as those books existed, people had access to ideas that challenged the emperor's absolute authority. The books had to go. In 213 BC, the chancellor Li Si presented the emperor with a proposal. Li Si was a legalist through and through, a man of formidable intelligence and complete ruthlessness. He had built his career on the idea that strict control was the only path to stability. His proposal was this: all books in private hands throughout the entire empire were to be surrendered to local authorities within 30 days. The only exceptions, books on medicine, agriculture, divination, and the official history of the Qin dynasty itself. Everything else was to be burned. The historical records of other states, burned. The philosophical texts of Confucianism, Taoism, Mohism, burned. The poetry of the 100 schools, burned. The scientific and mathematical texts of the pre-Qin period, burned. Anyone found possessing a prohibited book after the 30-day deadline would be branded and sentenced to forced labor on the Great Wall. Anyone who used the content of a prohibited book to criticize the present government would be executed, and everyone around them would be executed too. Anyone who failed to report prohibited books in their possession or their community would also be executed. The penalty for knowledge, death. The emperor approved the proposal, and across China the fires began. Try to understand the scale of what was lost. China in 213 BC was one of the most intellectually sophisticated civilizations on Earth. The 100 schools of thought had produced 5 centuries of philosophical, scientific, literary, and historical writing. Scholars had been collecting, copying, and preserving texts since before the time of Confucius. Libraries existed in every state. Courts maintained archives. Scholars maintained personal collections. Some of the texts in circulation were already centuries old. All of it into the fire. We know from the texts that survived, partially in fragments through later reconstructions, what was lost. But what we know is only what someone managed to remember or to hide. What we don't know is what we don't know. There were scientific texts from the pre-Qin period on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering. How much of that knowledge was lost? We cannot say. We only know what the fragments suggest. There were historical records from every state, records of events, of political decisions, of famines and floods and migrations and battles that Qin burned because they provided an alternative narrative to the one the emperor wanted told. There were philosophical texts from schools of thought that we now know only as names. Sophists who developed logical frameworks we cannot reconstruct because their primary texts are gone. Naturalists who developed theories of the physical world that we cannot evaluate because we have only references to them, not the texts themselves. The 100 schools became, after 213 BC, fewer schools. The diversity of Chinese thought was narrowed deliberately and violently to what the Qin state considered acceptable. And then came the scholars. 1 year after the burning of the books, in 212 BC, a group of scholars and alchemists at the Qin court were discovered to have been spreading criticism of the emperor. Some had fled. Some had spoken too openly about their contempt for the emperor's policies. Qin Shi Huang's response was swift and absolute. He ordered an investigation. The investigation spread. Scholars informed on other scholars. The net of accusation widened. In the end, 460 scholars were condemned, and the emperor ordered them buried alive, in pits in the earth beneath the empire they had served. His own son, Prince Fusu, reportedly protested this decision. He wrote to his father arguing that the scholars were men of learning who were only following their Confucian duty to speak truth to power, that executing them would turn the people against the emperor. Qin Shi Huang's response was to exile his son to the northern frontier to supervise the building of the Great Wall under a military commander. It was, effectively, a death sentence. The emperor's chosen heir, banished for showing mercy. The 460 scholars were buried, and Qin Shi Huang tried to make sure no one would remember what he had done. Here is where the story becomes something even darker, because the book burning and the burial of scholars are not just atrocities. They are the world's first documented attempt at total information control. Li Si and Qin Shi Huang were not simply destroying books out of anger or fear. They were implementing a systematic theory of how to control a population of 40 million people across a vast empire. The theory went like this. If people have access to alternative histories, histories of states that were conquered, of rulers who were overthrown, of different ways of organizing society, then they have the intellectual tools to imagine alternatives to the current order. If people have access to philosophical frameworks that evaluate the ruler's behavior, Confucian ethics, Taoist principles of natural harmony, Mohist universal love, then they have the moral vocabulary to criticize the emperor. Remove the books and you remove the vocabulary. Remove the vocabulary and you remove the ability to think certain thoughts. Remove the ability to think certain thoughts and you remove the possibility of organized resistance. It was in its way a theory of profound sophistication, and it almost worked. Almost. Because the scholars of China did what scholars always do when knowledge is threatened. They hid it. Before the book burning began, some scholars saw what was coming. They copied texts, they memorized texts, entire books committed to memory, word for word. They hid scrolls in walls, under floors, in sealed jars buried in the ground. One of the most famous stories of survival involves a scholar named Fu Sheng. Fu Sheng was a professor of the Book of History, one of the ancient texts targeted by the Qin burning. According to legend, he hid his copy of the book in a wall of his house before the burners arrived. After the fall of the Qin dynasty, he retrieved it.